A 6-7-year-old man named Cornelius came to me 22 months ago. He had been a secondary school science teacher for 35 years. Methodical, evidence-driven. The kind of man who had spent his career teaching young people to question assumptions, to test hypotheses, to never accept a conclusion without examining the conditions under which it was reached. He had been a type 2 diabetic for 6 years, and he had been eating oatmeal every single morning for 5 of those 6 years, because his diabetic nurse had told him it was one of the best breakfast choices he could make. She had said the word fiber. She had said the words slow release. She had said the word beneficial. And Cornelius, a science teacher who understood the importance of specificity, had accepted those words without asking the question he asked every student who presented him with an incomplete conclusion. Under what conditions? He came to me because his HbA1c had not moved below 7.6 in 3 years. His fasting blood sugar every morning was running between 8.1 and 9.4. His cardiologist had flagged early coronary artery calcification at his last review. His nephrologist had noted a slow but measurable decline in his eGFR over the previous 18 months. His triglycerides were elevated at 3.4 millimoles per liter despite a statin, and he was eating oatmeal every morning with a sliced banana and a drizzle of honey, because he had been told it was the healthy choice, the diabetic appropriate choice. The breakfast that protected his blood sugar rather than spiking it. He had never once tested his blood sugar 90 minutes after that breakfast. Not because the idea had not occurred to him, because nobody had suggested he do so, because the oatmeal had been presented as the answer, and when something is presented as the answer, the question stops being asked. He was a science teacher. He understood better than most people the specific danger of stopping the question. At our second appointment, I asked him to do one thing before we met again: eat his usual breakfast. The oatmeal, the banana, the honey, and check his blood sugar at 90 minutes. Write down the number, bring it to me. He came back with the number written on a piece of paper he had folded in half with the particular precision of a man who has been keeping records for 35 years. He placed it on the desk between us without speaking. It read 14.3 millimoles per liter. He looked at me and then he said, "That is not a slow-release breakfast. That is a spike. And I should have tested it 3 years ago." I'm Dr. Kevin Adewale. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've spent over 30 years operating on hearts, repairing arteries, and watching what chronic post-meal blood sugar elevation does to the vascular system of a diabetic body from the inside. What I'm about to share with you, most doctors won't bring up at your annual checkup. But after 60, it matters more than you think. Today, I am going to tell you the truth about oatmeal and diabetes. Not the simplified version that fits into a 7-minute diabetic review appointment, the complete version. The version that explains why oatmeal is simultaneously one of the most evidence-based foods in metabolic nutrition and one of the most misunderstood and most dangerously misapplied breakfast choices for diabetic adults over 60. I am going to explain exactly which forms of oatmeal protect blood sugar, which forms destroy it, what the conditions are that determine which category your bowl falls into, and what to do differently starting tomorrow morning. Stay with me, because the third variable I describe is the one that transforms a bowl of oatmeal from a diabetic ally into a blood sugar catastrophe without anyone knowing it happened. And it is operating in the breakfast bowls of millions of diabetic seniors who have been told they are doing the right thing. Before I take you through the specific variables, I need to address the foundational question that most content about oatmeal and diabetes never adequately answers. Why does oatmeal have a reputation as a diabetic-friendly food in the first place? Because the reputation is not invented, there is real, credible, peer-reviewed science behind it, and understanding what that science actually shows as opposed to what the reputation implies is the only way to Understand why so many diabetic adults are getting the oatmeal story wrong? Think of it this way. Oats contain a specific type of soluble fiber called beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is not simply a dietary fiber in the general sense. It is a biologically active compound with a specific and well-characterized mechanism for affecting blood sugar. When beta-glucan encounters water in the stomach and the small intestine, it dissolves to form a viscous gel, a thick, sticky substance that coats the inner surface of the intestinal wall and physically slows the passage of food through the digestive tract. That gel does two things simultaneously that are directly relevant to blood sugar management. First, it creates a physical barrier between the intestinal wall and the carbohydrate molecules in the food. Carbohydrates must pass through that gel to reach the digestive enzymes and the intestinal epithelium that absorb them. The gel slows that passage. Carbohydrates that would reach the bloodstream in 30 minutes without the beta-glucan gel take 60 or 90 minutes with it. The glucose arrives in the portal circulation more slowly. The blood sugar rise is more gradual. The insulin demand per unit time is reduced. The post-meal spike is blunted. Second, the gel binds bile acids in the intestine and prevents their reabsorption. Bile acids are synthesized from cholesterol in the liver when they are excreted in bile and then prevented from being reabsorbed by beta-glucan binding. The liver must draw LDL cholesterol from the circulation to replace them. LDL falls. This is the FDA-approved mechanism behind the Oats cholesterol-lowering health claim: 3 grams of beta-glucan daily, achievable from 1 bowl of appropriate oatmeal, reduces LDL cholesterol as part of a low-saturated fat diet. The science behind beta-glucan is real. The cholesterol evidence is robust. The blood sugar evidence for beta-glucan, specifically for the gel-forming soluble fiber in its intact, biologically active form, is consistent and credible. A meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition confirmed that beta-glucan from oats significantly reduced post-meal blood glucose and insulin responses in both healthy and diabetic adults compared to control conditions. The fiber works, the mechanism is specific, the evidence is legitimate. Here is where the story becomes specifically and urgently important for diabetic adults over 60. The beta-glucan mechanism operates only when the beta-glucan is present in its intact, high molecular weight, gel-forming form, and the gel-forming capacity of beta-glucan is exquisitely sensitive to the processing conditions to which the oat has been subjected before it reaches the bowl. Processing, grinding, rolling, pre-cooking, baking, extruding reduces the molecular weight of the beta-glucan chains. Shorter chains form weaker gels. Weaker gels create smaller physical barriers to carbohydrate absorption. Less slowing, more rapid glucose delivery, a higher blood sugar spike. The oatmeal that carries the beta-glucan health reputation and the oatmeal that delivers that beta-glucan in the form required to produce the effect are frequently not the same product. And the difference between them is the difference between a bowl that protects blood sugar and a bowl that spikes it to 14.3 in 90 minutes in a man who has been eating it every morning for 5 years. The first variable that determines which side of that line your oatmeal falls on is the type of oat. And this is where most of the confusion begins, because the names on the packets suggest a spectrum of refinement when the reality is a cliff edge between two fundamentally different metabolic events. Steel-cut oats, also called Irish oats or pinhead oats, are the minimally processed form. The whole oat grow, the complete grain as it comes from the plant, with only the indigestible outer husk removed, is cut into 2 or 3 pieces by steel blades. That is the entire process. The cellular structure of the grain is largely intact. The beta-glucan is inside the cell walls. The digestive system must physically breach those cell walls to access the starch inside. That work takes time. The starch is released slowly. The beta-glucans, released as the cells are breached, forms a gel in the presence of the water from cooking. The gel is high molecular weight. The chains are long. The viscosity is high. the physical barrier to carbohydrate absorption is substantial. The blood sugar rise after a bowl of steel-cut oats cooked with water, eaten with no added sugar and with protein alongside, is gradual, moderate, and manageable in a way that has been confirmed by glycemic index measurement. Steel-cut oats have a glycemic index of approximately 42 to 55 depending on cooking time and preparation. That is in the low to moderate range. That is the oat that is earning the reputation. Rolled oats, also called old-fashioned oats, are the oat grown steamed and then flattened by rollers into a flake. The steaming softens the grain. The rolling flattens it and breaks the cellular structure that was intact in the steel-cut version. The beta-glucan is partially released from the cell walls by the steaming process. The starch is partially gelatinized, pre-cooked by the heat. The result is an oat that digests somewhat more rapidly than stale-cut oats. The glycemic index is approximately 55 to 65, still in the moderate range. Still containing meaningful beta-glucan, still capable of producing a modest post-meal glucose response if consumed in the right conditions, but the gel that forms is less viscous than the steel-cut gel. The protection is real but reduced, and the margin for error for combining factors that will push the blood sugar further is smaller. Instant oats, quick oats, 1-minute oats, microwavable oat sachets are the oat groat that has been steamed, rolled to a much thinner flake, dried and often pre-cooked further. The cellular structure is completely disrupted. The beta-glucan chains are fragmented. The starch is substantially pre-gelatinized. When you add water to instant oats, there is almost no digestive work for the body to do. The starch is immediately accessible. The glucose arrives in the portal circulation rapidly. The glycemic index is approximately 65 to 83. That is in the moderate to high range. For a healthy adult with normal insulin sensitivity, a bowl of instant oats is a manageable blood sugar event. For a diabetic adult, over 60 whose insulin response is already impaired, a bowl of instant oats consumed at the start of the day on top of the dawn phenomenon, blood sugar that has already been rising since 3 in the morning, is a significant glycemic challenge. Not impossible to manage, but requiring every other variable to be correct, with no margin for error. In a population whose margin for error is already narrow, the granola and oat clusters I described in a previous video sit at the far end of the spectrum: baked, high-temperature processed, pre-gelatinized starch, fragmented beta-glucan, added sugar, glycemic index comparable to white bread, not an oat product with a metabolic character resembling the steel-cut original, an entirely different metabolic event wearing the same ingredient's name. Here is what is actually happening inside the body when a bowl of instant oats is consumed by a diabetic adult over 60. The pre-gelatinized starch encounters digestive enzymes, alpha amylase, in the saliva and the pancreatic secretions, alpha glucosidase, on the intestinal brush border, and the enzymatic conversion to glucose is rapid because the physical work of breaching intact cell walls has already been done by the industrial processing. The glucose arrives in the portal circulation within 15 to 30 minutes of consumption. Blood sugar rises steeply. In a diabetic body where the first phase insulin response is impaired, the rapid initial insulin release that should blunt the first 30 minutes of post-meal glucose rise, that steep rise is not adequately managed. The blood sugar peaks at a level that the impaired insulin response cannot efficiently address. Glycation accelerates. Endothelial inflammation is activated. The post-meal blood sugar stays elevated for 2 to 3 hours, 90 minutes after the bowl. The number is 14.3. That was Cornelius's result. From a bowl of rolled oats that he described as not instant, but not steel-cut either. From the type sitting between the two extremes, consumed with a ripe banana, delivering 27 grams of rapidly absorbed natural sugar with essentially no fat or protein to slow the glucose. Drizzled with honey, delivering 17 grams of fructose and glucose in a form the body converts to blood glucose within 15 minutes. and consumed within 20 minutes of waking, before the cortisol awakening response of the dawn phenomenon had begun to subside. Adding the morning hormonal glucose surge to the dietary glucose surge simultaneously. 3 variables working against him at the same time. 3 variables that nobody had asked about. 3 variables that transformed an evidence-based food into a 14.3 millimole reading at 90 minutes. Let me ask you something directly. Have you ever tested your blood sugar 90 minutes after your usual breakfast? Not fasting, not 2 hours after eating by the standard protocol. At 90 minutes, the point at which the post-meal glucose peak is at its maximum in most diabetic adults. If you eat oatmeal every morning and you have never captured that number, you may have no idea what your breakfast is doing to your blood sugar. And not knowing means the decision about whether your breakfast is protecting you or harming you is being made on reputation rather than data. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever checked that number? And if you have, what did you find? Because the answer to that question tells me more about the state of diabetic nutrition education in this country than any clinical audit I have read. The second variable is the additions. And this is where the most well-intentioned diabetic adults create the most damage through additions that are individually reasonable, collectively catastrophic, and never reviewed by the clinical team because nobody asks about the additions. They ask about the oatmeal. They do not ask about what goes on top of it. The ripe banana is the most common offender. I described the banana specifically in the blood sugar video. A ripe medium banana, the browner the skin, the more the starch is converted to sugar, contains approximately 27 grams of carbohydrate, primarily fructose and glucose, with a glycemic index of 51 to 62 depending on ripeness. That is a significant glucose delivery added to the carbohydrate already in the oatmeal. A standard bowl of rolled oats contains approximately 27 grams of carbohydrate. Combined with a medium banana, the breakfast delivers 54 grams of carbohydrate before anything else is added. In a diabetic body with impaired insulin response, 54 grams of carbohydrate, the majority of it, in rapidly absorbed forms from the instant oat and the ripe banana, is a blood sugar challenge that no amount of beta-glucan in a partially processed oat can adequately buffer. Honey and maple syrup added for sweetness. Both are predominantly fructose and glucose. Honey delivers 17 grams of sugar per tablespoon. Maple syrup delivers 13 grams. Neither contains fiber. Neither is metabolically different from table sugar in its effect on the post-meal blood glucose in a diabetic body. The natural origin of these sweeteners does not change the glycemic consequence. The pancreatic beta cells do not distinguish between the glucose from honey and the glucose from white sugar. They produce insulin, or attempt to, in response to blood glucose concentration. And in a body where that response is impaired, 17 grams of rapidly absorbed sugar from honey added to 54 grams of the carbohydrate from oatmeal and banana produces a blood sugar surge that the limited insulin response cannot manage. Brown sugar, raisins, dried fruit of any kind, flavored oat sachets with added fruit pieces and sugar which can contain 12 to 18 grams of added sugar per serving before any additions. Commercial oat milk as a topping which contains significantly more carbohydrate than dairy milk and lacks the fat that slows gastric emptying. And fruit juice alongside the oatmeal, which I described in the drinks video as delivering rapidly absorbed sugar with no fiber to moderate its effect. Each addition seems modest in isolation. Together they construct a breakfast that delivers the blood sugar spike of a confectionery product while carrying the nutritional credibility of a whole grain. Here is what is actually happening inside the body when that combination arrives. The starch from the processed oat, the sugar from the banana, the glucose from the honey, and the fructose from the fruit pieces all arrive in the small intestine simultaneously. The intestinal enzymes, already less efficient in an aging digestive system, are overwhelmed with the volume of carbohydrate requiring conversion. What little beta-glucan gel has formed from the partially processed oat is insufficient to slow the absorption of the total carbohydrate load. The glucose floods the portal circulation. Blood sugar rises rapidly and steeply. The impaired insulin response cannot keep pace. The peak reaches levels 12, 13, 14 millimoles per liter that produce immediate glycation of arterial, war proteins, immediate endothelial inflammation, and immediate vascular damage every morning before the day has made any other demand. Research published in Nutrition Journal confirmed that oatmeal breakfast composition, specifically the addition of high glycemic toppings, significantly modified the post-meal glycemic response in diabetic adults. With the addition of a ripe banana and honey to a rolled oat base, producing post-meal blood glucose peaks comparable to white bread consumption at equivalent carbohydrate content, the oatmeal was not the problem. The oatmeal with the additions was. The distinction matters enormously. And it is almost never made in the diabetic dietary review that tells the patient to eat oatmeal. The third variable is the one I told you would transform a diabetic alley into a blood sugar catastrophe, the timing relative to waking. And this is the variable that most completely explains why the same bowl of oatmeal that produces a manageable post-meal glucose in an evening snack context produces a dangerous spike when consumed in the first 30 minutes after waking. Here is what is actually happening inside the body in the first 30 minutes after waking. The dawn phenomenon, which I described in the blood sugar video in detail, has been running since approximately 3 in the morning. Cortisol, glucagon, and growth hormone have been instructing the liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream. By the time the alarm goes off, the fasting blood sugar is already elevated. In Cornelius's case, between 8.1 and 9.4 millimoles per liter. That is the baseline. That is the starting point from which breakfast will drive the blood sugar further. In the first 30 minutes after waking, cortisol is still near its peak. Cortisol directly increases insulin resistance in the peripheral tissues. The muscles and the fat cells that would normally absorb glucose from the bloodstream, the cortisol peak means that the insulin resistance is at its worst of the entire day. The cells are least responsive to insulin at exactly the moment when the first meal is being consumed and creating the greatest demand for insulin-mediated glucose clearance. This is why I recommended in the blood sugar video waiting 60 to 90 minutes after waking before eating to allow the cortisol peak to begin subsiding before adding dietary glucose to a blood sugar that is already elevated and being managed by a system at its most insulin-resistant point of the day. Adding a high-carbohydrate breakfast, even one made from oatmeal, within 20 minutes of waking means delivering a significant glucose load to a body in which the hepatic glucose release of the dawn phenomenon is still active. The cortisol-mediated insulin resistance is at its peak, and the impaired insulin response is already working to manage the fasting blood sugar elevation before the meal has added its own contribution. The combination is not additive, it is compounding. The fasting blood sugar of 8.1 becomes the floor from which the post-meal spike ascends, rather than the ceiling it would become in a body whose morning glucose management was operating adequately. Here's what the research shows about meal timing and post-meal blood sugar in diabetic adults. A study published in Diabetes Care found that delaying breakfast by 60 to 90 minutes after waking reduced post-meal blood glucose peaks by a clinically significant margin in adults with type 2 diabetes, compared to eating immediately on waking, without any change in the content of the meal. The same food, the same amount, the same oatmeal, a different time on the clock, a different outcome on the glucose monitor. The timing was the variable, and it was a variable that nobody in Cornelius's diabetic management had ever mentioned. The fourth variable is the protein deficit. Most people eat oatmeal alone or with additions that are predominantly carbohydrate. They do not eat it after protein. They do not combine it with a protein source that would slow gastric emptying, moderate the rate of carbohydrate absorption, and blunt the insulin response through the incretin mechanisms I described in the morning blood sugar video. The oatmeal arrives in the small intestine without the fat and protein buffer. That changes the metabolic character of the meal. Here's what is actually happening inside the body. When protein is consumed before carbohydrate, protein in the stomach stimulates the release of glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, and other incretin hormones from the intestinal L cells. GLP-1 does multiple things simultaneously that are beneficial for blood sugar management. It stimulates insulin secretion from the beta cells, enhancing the impaired insulin response of the diabetic pancreas. It inhibits glucagon release from the alpha cells, reducing the hormonal signal that drives hepatic glucose output. It slows gastric emptying, reducing the rate at which the carbohydrate from the subsequent oatmeal is delivered to the small intestine for digestion and absorption, and it promotes satiety, producing the total food intake at the meal. Research from the Weill Cornell Medical Center, which I described in the morning blood sugar video, confirmed that eating protein and fat before carbohydrate at the same meal reduced post-meal blood glucose peaks by 28 to 37% compared to eating the carbohydrate first, the same foods, the same total amount, the protein and fat eaten first, the carbohydrate eaten after, a 28 to 37% reduction in the glucose peak. For a diabetic adult whose oatmeal breakfast is producing a 90-minute reading of 14.3, a 37% reduction means reaching 9.0 still elevated. But the difference between a reading of 14.3 and a reading of 9.0 at 90 minutes is the difference between severe glycation and moderate glycation occurring every morning in the arterial walls, the retinal vessels, the kidney glomeruli, and the cardiac microvasculature. It is a clinically meaningful difference produced by eating 2 eggs before the oatmeal rather than after it. The fifth variable is portion size, and this is the simplest of the 5 variables and the one most consistently underestimated by diabetic adults who measure dry oats before cooking rather than after. A standard serving of rolled oats is typically listed as 40 grams dry weight, approximately half a cup. Most adults pour significantly more than that. A full cup of dry rolled oats weighs approximately 80 grams and contains approximately 54 grams of carbohydrate. A generous bowl that fills the average cereal bowl contains 60 to 70 grams of dry oats, 40 grams of carbohydrate before any additions. Here's what is actually happening inside the body when portion size exceeds the threshold that the remaining beta-glucan can protect. The gel that beta-glucan forms in the intestine has a finite viscosity creating capacity per unit of carbohydrate. A specific mass of beta-glucan can slow the absorption of a specific carbohydrate load. When the carbohydrate load exceeds that capacity from either a larger portion of oatmeal or from the additions I described, the protective effect of the beta-glucan is overwhelmed. The gel is present. It is forming, it is doing its work, but it is insufficient for the carbohydrate volume it is being asked to moderate. The glucose arrival rate in the portal circulation exceeds what the gel can slow. The spike occurs. The research on beta-glucan and blood sugar dose dependence confirms that the protective effect operates within a specific carbohydrate to beta-glucan ratio. When that ratio is exceeded by portion size, by additions, or by the reduced beta-glucan concentration of more processed oat varieties, the protection fails. The oatmeal's reputation does not scale linearly with the portion size and the additions. The protection has a ceiling, and most diabetic adults consuming oatmeal are eating above that ceiling without knowing it exists. Let me bring all 5 variables together, because Cornelius had all 5 working against him simultaneously. And what they produced was not a failure of oatmeal as a food, it was a failure of oatmeal as it was being consumed in the wrong form at the wrong time, with the wrong additions in the wrong portion size, and without the protein buffer that would have changed the metabolic context of every other variable. Rolled oats rather than steel-cut reduced beta-glucan molecular weight, less viscous gel, faster carbohydrate absorption. Ripe banana plus honey additions, 44 grams of additional rapidly absorbed carbohydrate on top of the oatmeal's base. Carbohydrate load. Consumed within 20 minutes of waking on top of a dawn phenomenon, blood sugar already running at 9.4 during the cortisol peak of maximum insulin resistance. No protein consumed beforehand, no GLP-1 mediated gastric emptying delay, no incretin enhancement of the impaired insulin response, and a generous bowl that exceeded the portion size at which the beta-glucan concentration could adequately protect the carbohydrate load being delivered. 5 variables, all 5 correctable. None of them requiring a new prescription, none of them requiring a referral, all of them requiring the question that Cornelius, a science teacher who had spent 35 years asking questions, had stopped asking because the oatmeal had been presented as the answer. Knowledge without action is just worry. I am not here to make you anxious. I am here to give you a plan. I call this the diabetic oatmeal optimization protocol. 5 specific changes beginning tomorrow morning. Step 1. Switch to steel-cut oats. Not rolled, not quick cook, not instant. Steel cut, the groat cut into pieces by blades with the cellular structure largely intact and the beta-glucan in its highest molecular weight, most gel-forming state. Yes, they take longer to cook, 20 to 30 minutes on the stovetop or overnight in a slow cooker with water set on the lowest setting before you go to bed, ready when you wake. That overnight preparation removes the time objection entirely. The slow cooker does the work while you sleep. The oats are ready, the beta-glucan is intact, the protection is present. Step 2. Remove all high glycemic additions. No banana on top of oatmeal. If you want fruit with breakfast, choose a small handful of berries, blueberries, raspberries, or strawberries. Their glycemic index is significantly lower. Their polyphenol content is independently beneficial for insulin sensitivity through the same AMPK pathway I described in the ACV video. No honey, no maple syrup, no brown sugar, no dried fruit, no flavored sachets. If sweetness is essential, a small amount of cinnamon, which has independent evidence for modest improvements in insulin sensitivity, and a few crushed walnuts provide flavor and texture without the glucose consequence. The palate adapts to less sweetness within 2 to 4 weeks. The adjustment is temporary. The blood sugar benefit is permanent. Step 3. Eat protein before the oatmeal. 2 eggs, scrambled, poached, boiled, any preparation. Eat the eggs first, all of them, then eat the oatmeal. That sequence takes no more time than the rest. It requires no additional cooking. It changes the metabolic context of the entire meal by triggering the GLP-1 response that slows gastric emptying before the carbohydrate arrives. The 28 to 37% reduction in post-meal glucose peak from the protein-first sequence is not a small effect. It is the difference between a reading of 14.3 and a reading approaching 9.0 at 90 minutes. Step 4. Wait 60 minutes after waking before eating. I described the biological rationale in the morning blood sugar video, and I have elaborated it here. The cortisol peak of the dawn phenomenon is at its maximum within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking. Eating during that window means eating during a period of maximum insulin resistance and maximum hepatic glucose output. Eating 60 minutes after waking allows the cortisol to begin falling, the insulin resistance to partially reduce, and the hepatic glucose output to begin moderating. That 60-minute window is not idle time. Walk, shower, take your morning medications. Drink the ACV preparation I described in the previous video, which is specifically timed to this pre-breakfast window to address the hepatic AMPK pathway directly, 60 minutes. Then the protein, then the oatmeal. Step 5. Measure your oats before cooking using a kitchen scale. 40 grams of dry steel-cut oats. That is the portion associated with the 3 grams of beta-glucan that the FDA-approved cholesterol health claim is based. On that is the portion within which the beta-glucan concentration is sufficient to produce its gel-forming protective effect for the carbohydrate volume being delivered. More than 40 grams and you are exceeding the protection on the bowl. Beta-glucan can provide for the additional carbohydrate, less than 40 grams, and the bowl feels insufficient and the temptation to add banana and honey becomes irresistible. 40 grams with the protein first, with the berries rather than the banana. At 60 minutes after waking, from a steel-cut oat with intact beta-glucan, that is the bowl that earns the reputation. And at 90 minutes after that breakfast, for the first 2 weeks of the change, check your blood sugar. Write down the reading. Compare it to the 90-minute readings from your previous breakfast pattern if you have them. If you do not have previous 90-minute readings, the comparison will come from your HbA1c at your next diabetic review. Either way, the data will show you what the change produces, not what someone told you oatmeal would do. What your oatmeal, prepared correctly, actually does in your specific metabolism at 90 minutes with the number on the monitor. I want to come back to Cornelius. He made all 5 changes. He bought a slow cooker. He prepared his steel-cut oats overnight 3 evenings per week and made enough for 2 mornings. He stopped buying the bunch of bananas he had placed on the kitchen counter every Monday for 5 years. He replaced them with frozen berries he portioned into small bags. He began eating 2 scrambled eggs first before the oats. He waited 65 minutes after waking, during which time he completed his morning walk and his ACV drink, and he weighed 40 grams of oats on a kitchen scale that he had not used since his wife had briefly attempted sourdough bread during the pandemic. At 4 weeks, his 90-minute post-breakfast reading, which he checked every morning with the methodical record-keeping of a 35-year science teacher, had moved from an average of 13.8 to an average of 8.4. At 8 weeks, 7.9. His fasting morning readings, which had been running between 8.1 and 9.4, were averaging 7.0. At his 12-week diabetic review, his HbA1c was 6.9%, down from 7.6 on the same metformin dose, without a medication change, without any change beyond what happens between waking and the completion of breakfast. His diabetic nurse asked him what he had changed. He described the 5 variables. She noted them in his file. Then she looked at him and said that she had been recommending oatmeal for years. He said under what conditions. She did not have an immediate answer for that. He came back to see me 8 weeks after his 12-week review. He sat across from me with the particular satisfaction of a science teacher who has designed an experiment, controlled the variables, collected the data, and arrived at a conclusion that the evidence supports. He placed his blood sugar diary on the desk, 35 years of meticulous record-keeping habits in a notebook he had, bought specifically for this purpose. He tapped the most recent entry. It read 6.8 fasting, 7.6 at 90 minutes post-breakfast. He looked at me, and then he said the thing that has stayed with me ever since. He said, "I told my students for 35 years that the answer is only as good as the question." He paused, then he looked at his notebook, and then he said, "Nobody asked me what conditions my oatmeal was being eaten under. Nobody asked the most important question. That is the truth about oatmeal and diabetes. Oatmeal is not simply good or bad. It is good or bad depending on the form, the additions, the timing, the protein context, and the portion size. Under the wrong conditions, it produces a 14.3. Under the right conditions, it produces a 7.6. The food is the same. The conditions determine everything, and the conditions are something anyone can change. Starting tomorrow morning, with a slow cooker set the night before and a question finally being asked, let me say each variable one final time. The form, steel-cut oats with intact beta-glucan and high molecular weight gel-forming capacity, not rolled or instant oats with fragmented beta-glucan and pre-gelatinized starch. The additions, minus berries and cinnamon and walnuts, not banana and honey and dried fruit, that add 40 grams of rapidly absorbed carbohydrate to the base load. The timing, 60 minutes after waking, not within 20 minutes. Not during the cortisol peak of maximum insulin resistance and maximum hepatic glucose output. The protein context, 2 eggs eaten first, triggering GLP-1 mediated gastric emptying delay and incretin-enhanced insulin response before the carbohydrate arrives. And the portion size, 40 grams dry weight, measured within the range at which the beta-glucan concentration is sufficient to protect the carbohydrate load being delivered. 5 variables, 5 corrections. One breakfast that finally earns the reputation it has been carrying for the 5 years you have been eating it. Which of these 5 variables do you recognize in your own morning routine? The instant oats instead of steel cut, the banana you eat with it every morning, the bowl consumed within 15 minutes of waking, or the 90-minute reading you have never taken because nobody suggested you should. Tell me in the comments. I've read every single one, and your answers help me understand how many diabetic seniors are getting the most important meal of their day wrong in a way that nobody has explained because the question was never asked completely. If this video gave you something that changes what goes into your breakfast bowl tomorrow morning, share it. Not for me, for the person in your life with diabetes who eats oatmeal every morning because their diabetic nurse told them it was a safe choice, and who has never once tested their blood sugar 90 minutes after eating it. Who does not know that rolled oats with a banana and honey is producing a blood sugar equivalent to a biscuit? Who has been following the recommendation without knowing the conditions under which the recommendation applies? They may not know that the conditions matter more than the food, but you do now, and that is exactly why you are here. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Every week I bring you honest, evidence-based information that I wish every one of my patients had access to long before they needed surgery. Take care of your heart. It has been working for you every single minute of every single day without asking for anything in return. Give it what it needs. It is a fair trade. One last thing, and this is important. Everything I have shared today is general medical information based on published research and my clinical experience as a cardiac surgeon. It is not a substitute for your personal medical care. Please do not change your medications or your prescribed dietary management plan without speaking to your own physician or diabetic care team first. If you are on insulin or sulfonylurea medication and you implement the changes I have described, please monitor your blood sugar more frequently in the first 2 weeks. The combination of a lower glycemic breakfast with your current medication dose may produce lower blood sugar readings that require a medication adjustment. That adjustment requires a clinician who knows your full clinical picture. They know your history. They know your numbers. I do not. This is education. Use it as the beginning of that conversation. The conversation that Cornelius wishes someone had started with him 5 years earlier when the oatmeal was first recommended, without the conditions being explained.